Where there's a will, there's a way, goes the old proverb, but it surely wasn't intended to encourage younger generations to rely on legacies. Bitter intergenerational disputes can arise over inheritance. Do we have the right to expect to receive one from relations? Do we boomers owe it to the millennials to pass them our wealth? To debate this, I'm joined by two men who have pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps. Lord Daniel Moylan, a Conservative life peer in the House of Lords, and the commentator and journalist Benjamin Butterworth. Benjamin Butterworth, one of the things that happens when generations pass money down to another generation is that this entrenches inequality. Is that something that we should be bothered about?
I mean, it's certainly a problem with a country that relies on inheritance, because then you do run the danger that people who aren't from families with property wealth, basically, will be disadvantaged for another generation. But I think ultimately the biggest gap we have in terms of inequality these days is between the generations. Because what you've seen, compared with my grandparents, who've passed on in the last few years, compared to your grandparents' generation, is a massive change in the value of assets like property and how far the average income goes. In fact, for context, a house has not been as out of proportion with average incomes today since the 1860s. So that's the kind of situation we're dealing with. And so what you've got is a generation that has vastly inflated the value of basic things like a home at the cost of millennials. And so that's why I think it's absolutely essential that they understand to pass that down, preferably before they die, because obviously, as the story in the Telegraph about not passing the inheritance down, most people these days will be in their 50s, maybe their 60s, maybe older by the time their parents die.
I entirely understand your argument about the inequality that has arisen between different generations, but I think some people might have been quite shocked to hear you describe that as the greatest inequality. Surely still the greatest inequality is between those who find it a great struggle to live and some of the people that we're talking about who probably sooner or later will get themselves on the housing ladder, but who would like to get there quicker by having some enormous legacy from their property-owning parents.
I think that the scale of the problem of generational equality is much bigger. And you see this reflected in people's political voting patterns. When you were at the forefront of politics, the biggest suggester of how someone would vote would be their class. But today it's their generation, it's their age. If someone's over 65, they're still a bit more likely to vote Tory, though even that's fading a little. But people under 40 are overwhelmingly likely to vote Labour, and that's been the case for 5-10 years now. And that's because of the inequality of access to wealth. And the truth is that, the average house price in this country, depending on where in the country you are, is 4 to 6 times higher now than what it would have been in the early to mid-90s. But we know that incomes in the last 15 years are barely back at where they were 15 years ago. And so you've got a generation that has been cut off from achieving their aspirations. And I think that's what a lot of people of the boomer generation don't recognise. I work hard, most of my peers work hard, but the ability to transfer that into assets and into quality of life is much harder.
Daniel Moylan, do you buy this argument? Do you think that this hard done by generation of people who've not had the luck that we had, getting onto the housing ladder fairly early, that they should feel entitled to get a legacy?
Well, Michael, I feel I'm here under false representations. I thought I was coming to hear a tribute from Benjamin to the older generation. Remember how we were brought up? We had no smartphones. We were lucky to have a plastic toy. Most families only had one holiday a year, and that was usually in Blackpool or Weston-super-Mare. Very few of us had the chance to go to university. I was one of the lucky ones. None of us blew £30,000 or plus on a wedding. And indeed, we children were so oppressed that we were actually expected to give up our seats on the bus and the tube to older folk. In exchange for all of these privations, and after a lifetime of contributions, what do we get? We get a state pension of about £11,000 a year, and a lot of people don't get that because they haven't got the contribution record. They get less, many of them women, and that's what we get, one of the lowest in the civilised world. And as for property prices, I'll give myself as an example. I've lived in the same place for 28 years. And it has gone up in price enormously over that time. But what does that mean to me? It means nothing at all to me. I'm not going to sell it. And if I did sell it, I'd only have to buy some place which had also gone up in price. It's my home. It doesn't make me any richer that I'm still living in the same place I've been living for 28 years.
The question...
And the fact is, oh yes, well, it's true that Benjamin and his generation might get some benefit from that when I die, but the fact that he wants to get his grubby mitts on my home already, where am I going to live? Where's he going to put me? Well, am I going to be put off into some sort of home or whatever, where I have to live in a cabin somewhere on a beach? Grubbing for vegetables in the Strand.
Bravo, Daniel. That was
this is terrible, Michael.
But I'd like to know how you approach the question of your death. I mean, it seems to me there could be three possible approaches.
Sorry, why is that being put to me on an ageist basis?
I think you're younger than I am. I put it to you on this basis, that you could, on your death, allow your wealth tied up in your house of 28 years, you could pass that to someone that you choose to pass it to. You could, on the other hand, pass it to an institution, for example, or some charitable cause, or you could make another decision, which Benjamin hinted at, which is that you could seek to release some money during your lifetime if there was someone that you thought could benefit from your wealth today. Take us through how you would approach those questions.
Well, a lot of people do the last. A lot of people do the last, and I'm not sure it's actually necessarily very wise. What it does is, I've seen it happen, not to me, I've seen it happen where families actually start to put pressure on older members, either to sell up and move out, or to take out one of these hugely expensive, and I think probably financially not very advantageous, equity release schemes, so that they can have some money now for whatever their purpose is. I think actually the sensible thing is patience and managing your own affairs rather than trying to leech off the elderly, who, as I say, in most cases have received no advantage whatsoever from the fact that their property has gone up in value, because it's still exactly the same home they moved into, sometimes decades ago, and they live in it.
Benjamin, let's raise the sort of ethical point. I think it is really morally decadent for people to live their lives in the expectation that at some point they're going to be showered with money by the death of an older relative. I mean, that must sort of eat away at your ability to look after yourself, your motivation. I've seen people, I've found it quite depressing, that their life plan has been, oh, well, in 10 years' time, Aunt so-and-so will die, and then after that, after 15 years, Uncle somebody else, and that is how I'm going to finance my life. I mean, that is morally decadent, is it not? I
mean, look, I was raised by my grandparents who have both passed, and I certainly never asked them about what my inheritance would be, and I certainly never pressured them to pass that down before they went. But I think the problem with your argument is that we live in a country whereby the ability to get on the housing ladder, which is the biggest financial challenge that any normal person faces, is simply unsurmountable in a lot of situations without that inheritance. And so it's not that they're acting with bad ethics, it's that their most plausible route to that financial security that not so long ago was taken for granted is to get it through inheritance. Now, you referenced it earlier about inequality between the very poorest and the very richest. That ought to be the big problem. But this is the most common problem. And I just make one other point, because, of course, Daniel worked hard, but the fact is that in the last 10 years, the generation that has gained the most wealth has been the baby boomers, has been the pensioners, and the wealth of those under 35 has proportionately fallen. So they're getting richer even when not working.
I wonder whether we've been realistic about this, Daniel, at all, because people are now living so long that when we talk about children inheriting, we're very often talking about people who are in their 60s. I mean, far too late to help them get onto the property ladder.
Well, I think you make a very good point about moral decadence. There's nothing new about it. Benjamin talked about the price of houses in the 1860s. Dickens' novels are full of young men who are living on their expectations, and they're borrowing money on the basis of their expectations. And it's very interesting that for Dickens, all of these young men are baddies. He regards them all as morally decadent. The good guys in Dickens' novels are the ones who get on by their own hard work and efforts and pull themselves up. And then when the inheritance comes, if it does come, then it's an uncovenanted bonus in their lives, and they haven't been chewing themselves up, expecting it all the way through.
The two of you are examples of hard work because you've turned up on a Sunday lunchtime